Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis, and this is Psychic 101, Class 4. And tonight we're going to be discussing different kinds of psychism. And there are many, many different kinds of psychism, many different ways that psychic abilities are used. But I want to start by repeating the point that psychism and psychic ability is a perfectly natural thing. It's part of all of our lives. We all do it all the time, unconsciously. What we're talking about here is learning to do it consciously. In fact, the entire universe, as I understand it, is made of psychic energy. It is the force that runs through all things. And naturally, we work with it constantly on a daily basis. And again, what we're doing here is learning to work with it in a conscious way. I want to start by talking about some of those unconscious ways that we use psychism and how we can move toward making them conscious. A lot of people use the term intuition for what is really psychism. When you get a feeling about something that maybe a good feeling, maybe a bad feeling, maybe a warning danger type of feeling, that's a psychic impression. But people often think of it as being intuition or just a hunch, just a gut feeling, and they write it off. In fact, these are aspects of psychism on an unconscious basis that we experience every day. When we walk into a place, and we've talked about this already in previous lessons, but when we walk into a place, into a room, into a home, and we feel very good or we feel very bad, it's because we're picking up on the psychic charge of that place, which is, again, a psychic effect, whether we think of it that way or not. For most people, they just experience the effect and don't really understand what it is. But when we study these things, we need to become aware that no, this is psychism and we must pay attention to it. Now, as with everything else psychic, and this is something we'll discuss a lot, when you're doing it, when you're receiving it, you can't really stop and analyze it. You have to let it be. You have to let it come to you. And then when it's come to you, you can analyze it. So let us say you meet a person and you immediately have a bad feeling from them. You don't necessarily want to stop at that moment to ask yourself why or to ask yourself if it's accurate. You want to let it come through and pay attention to what it's telling you. Afterwards, you can look at it again when it's no longer in the active process of coming to you. And you can ask yourself, does this actually seem cognizant with the things I know about the situation? And my advice is always to take it seriously, but there are times when you can ask yourself, is something else also going on? But generally, you want to just let it come to you when it's coming and then look at it. And I don't really recommend dismissing this kind of thing easily. In my experience, when I've met people, I would say by and large, my first impression of them has turned out to be the most accurate. When I was younger, I was taught to be very non-judgmental and not to be swayed by such things, despite coming from a very psychic family. And so I sometimes did not pay attention when I got a negative feeling from someone. I definitely do now, because I found that that feeling will generally lead you right. However, I will say there can be times when you want to reconsider it. Maybe you're just having a bad day. Maybe there's something else in the room that's giving a negative charge. You can look at those things and then see maybe what your second impression is. But I would be very careful in ignoring that intuition about people or places when it comes to you. These are some of the things that come to us in daily life from psychism. Often people will have dreams that will be psychic communications that may bring them knowledge about events that are happening, ideas about future events that are coming. And this too, you want to pay attention to. And when you wake up, My advice is when you have a dream, you should write it down immediately before it leaves your mind, because like most psychic things, it will. And then later you can come back to it and analyze it and say, is this a prophetic dream, or did I have heartburn or something? Not every dream is going to be a prophetic dream, but chances are, if you remembered it, there's a good likelihood that it is, that it is trying to tell you something, and you should pay attention. These things happen in everyone's life, whether they're consciously doing any kind of psychic work or not. They're a natural part of life, and all of psychism is, in the end, a natural part of life. But these are some of the very obvious ways. And you should pay attention to them, particularly when you yourself are studying psychism. You need to realize, if you have not already, that these are not random things that you're imagining. They are legitimate psychic impressions you should pay attention to. Let us say, for example, we were talking, I believe, previously about how a location, such as a house or other building, can take on a positive or a negative charge. If you're looking for an apartment and you walk into an apartment, you immediately get a bad feeling about it, you should not take that apartment. That is a psychic impression, and you should pay attention. I realize we don't always have that choice, but to the extent that you do, you should pay attention to what you're getting. Now, when we start talking about intentionally working with psychic energy, there are a number of different ways that we can do that. The most common way that people work with psychic energy is divination. And chances are, if you're in this class, you already know what divination is. You probably already do it, but we're going to talk about it as if you don't. Some of the popular kinds of divination include things like tarot cards, oracle cards, reading playing cards, rune cards, rune stones, things like astrology and numerology, all sorts of different kinds of divination. And there are literally hundreds of kinds of divination. Some of them today have become very obscure. Reading by smoke is an example of an obscure kind of divination that most people have probably not heard of. There are a couple of different ways to do that. One is if you're burning a candle, or if you're at a fire, you can watch the shapes the smoke makes and get messages from this as the smoke is created. Another thing you can do is you can take a piece of paper and hold it flat over the flame, a little bit above, so you're only getting the smoke, and then you take the paper and read the shapes the smoke has made on the paper. That's two ways of doing smoke divination. It's an uncommon form of divination. Reading tea leaves is very common. Reading coffee grounds is not, but is a very ancient and accurate form of divination. Another form of reading divination from beverages is if you add cream to your coffee or to your tea, watching the shapes it makes as it goes into the liquid can be used as a form of divination. People do this. You can literally divine by anything. Years ago, a good friend of mine, Robin Locherko, another one of those best psychics I have known, had a conversation on this subject with Lady Crystal, in which she gave the example that, if you have nothing else to read, you can read by the way light reflects on a ring. You can read by literally anything. And spirit will find a way to get your message to you. Why is this true? Divination is a way we speak with spirit, with deity, with however you want to call the great powers of the universe. And they can use any language to communicate with us, as long as we're clear on what it is. And this is why people around the world have developed so many kinds of divination, because it doesn't really matter what you use to get the message can come to you. One of the things I used to do when I lived in Chicago and was regularly using the public transportation system is I would ask questions as I was writing that I wanted an answer to. And I would pick relatively random things to be the source of my answer. For example, if I was asking a yes or no question, I might say, well, if the answer to this is yes, may the next hat that I see be red. And if the answer is no, be it some other color. And I would watch the people walking on the sidewalks and watch for those next hats. The next one to come up by its color would be the answer to my question. And I found this usually worked out quite well. Sometimes I do it with shirt colors. There are a lot of different ways to do that. They were quite randomly selected things, but they would give me my answers, and I found that they were quite accurate in what they gave. Sometimes I would do this by asking for a certain kind of animal. And in fact, divining by the sight of animals is another form of divination. Every animal has its meaning. There are all kinds of things you can do, but the point is that you must be clear on what the symbols mean to you. Divination is a systemized form of omens. Omens are symbols sent to us from spirit with meaning. And usually when we call them omens, it's a single thing. But it depends, because that word, like most others in the psychic realm, is used in many ways. But if you ask for an omen, what I was just talking about can be called an omen. But when we do divination, we're working with many omens all at once, and we're usually choosing them at random by effectively drawing lots. When you do a tarot reading, you're drawing random cards from the deck. When you do the kind of tea or coffee reading I was describing, you're looking for random symbols that are created. When you do the smoke reading, you're looking for random symbols. The randomness is extraordinarily important in the proceeding. And this is a way that deity uses to talk to us. Now, if you remember things we've said elsewhere, the whole universe is composed of psychic energy, and that psychic energy is part of deity. Therefore, our connection to deity is internal. It's always with us. And when we ask for a message, anything can be used to give that message. And if we believe the whole universe is composed of psychic energy, which is also deity, then anything in the universe can give us that answer. This is part of the meaning of the ancient Hermetic maxim, as above, so below. The idea that the creator of the universe, however you want to see that creator, is expressed in everything that's in that universe. It is a universal quality of existence. So if you ask for an omen, if you ask for a sign, it can come to you in any way. But the more precise you are in what you're asking for, the better what you get is going to be. This is why we use things like tarot cards. Tarot cards are very precise in the possible answers they can give. There are, in most tarot decks, there are the major arcana and four suits of minor arcana that can give you all kinds of information. Some tarot decks have a few more than this. Historic tarot decks sometimes have more, sometimes have less. But using all those different cards can give you very precise information. Something like the runes have a fewer number of omens, but they can still be very precise. Something like Ifa has, I believe, 256 verses that it can give you in response to an Ifa reading. There are all kinds of organized systems of omens that are used for divination, and others that are far more random, like the coffee shells or the coffee reading we were talking about. One of the early forms of divination, still used in some circles, is reading bones. And there are a lot of different ways to do this, but it obviously developed in early societies where there were bones left over from dinner, and they were an easy thing to use for a divination. In China, it was common to use tortoise shells in early ages for divination. And this has something to do with the sacred nature of the tortoise in Chinese mythology, its relationship to the Bagua and the I Ching. But what they would do is they would burn the shells and look for the cracks that would be created and then divine from those cracks. A very random source of events that nonetheless gave them very good answers. So this is one thing that we do when we study psychic arts. These are some of the arts we learn. Another thing that people do as a kind of psychism is psychic healing. And psychic healing is where you work with your energy and another person's energy to bring them emotional, spiritual, or theoretically physical healing. And there are many different ways of doing this. The two most common are pranic healing and Reiki healing, but they're not the only ones. And people who study the psychic arts often will learn this technique, whether they use it or on a regular basis or not. So let us talk a little bit about how we do this. With pranic healing, you are going through the body and looking for where things need done. We talked about scanning bodies in our last class. That's how you would find where you need to focus in pranic healing. And if you're looking for blockages, it will show you blockages. With blockages, you want to remove them in a physical way from the body. Usually when people do this, they reach out, they grab that energy with their physical hand or a psychic hand that they're visualizing, and they literally pull it out. And you want to pull all of it out that is blocked that you can pull, and you want to transmute it to change the negative charge to a positive one, which usually you can do by just letting it dissipate, or if you want to be more thorough, you can use purple light to transmute the energy. Then, ideally, you want to fill the empty space you have created with positive energy. That's a very, very simple description of pranic healing. We're going to talk in a future class in much greater detail about it, but that's a basic understanding of what you would do. You're going through the person's chakras and meridians and their auras, looking for what needs healing. Now, in Reiki works a little differently. In pranic healing, your consciousness is very involved in what you're doing. You're looking for what needs to happen. In Reiki, what you basically do is you activate the healing Reiki energy and largely turn over the process to it, and let it do what needs to be done. You don't personally necessarily know or need to know what's happening because the energy will do it itself. And this is part of that idea again, that the psychic energy we're working with is part of deity. Of course it knows what to do. Now, there are, of course, finer points of Reiki that we could go into, but that's the principal difference, as I understand it, between Reiki and pranic healing as forms of psychic healing. There are, of course, many other kinds of healing, too, that people work with, including very idiosyncratic forms that they develop on their own. And it's worth taking a moment to say that we're talking now about specific systems of divination and healing and so forth. But in addition to all those specific systems are the things you just develop for yourself, like my asking for a color of hat for the answer to a question, which is very idiosyncratic. You do not have to play with certain rules. You can create your own. What needs to happen with any of the things we're talking about in terms of divination and in terms of healing is that you need to be clear on what things mean to you when you ask for them from spirit, from the energy. The kind of psychic healing that I was trained in, although not strictly speaking pranic healing, worked on that same principle. You look for the blockages, you take them out, you put in positive energy. And also separately, you may just be putting in positive energy because it's what's needed. But one of the things that was very idiosyncratic about this is that when we worked with that energy, it would be revealed to us in visual forms because I'm a very visual person. Lady Crystal is a very visual person. We would see the energy we were working with in symbolic ways that told us things about that energy. So, for example, if we were working with a very new blockage, the energy felt a lot like mucus, for a better way to put it. It was thick, it was viscous, but it was not at all solid. If it was an older blockage, it often felt like fish bones, which is to say solid but flexible. Very distinct feeling, which meant that that blockage was taking root, but not extremely deep yet. And those were fairly easy to clear. But when a blockage had been there longer, it would be absolutely solid. And it might appear as stones. Sometimes it appeared as things like vegetables, meaning it had to be really dug out. But this was a way that these messages came to us because it had meaning for us and because we reacted to it when Spirit sent it, and it became our language for understanding things about this energy. What may happen for you working with this may be different. But that's part of everything in the psychic world. And you always want to allow individuality and difference. Now, we've talked about intuition and ways that psychicism shows up in our everyday life. We've talked about divination. We've talked about psychic healing. And now I'm going to talk about something that I regard as a more advanced skill that we will, again, be talking about in greater detail in future lessons, but that's mediumship. For a lot of people, this is what they think of as psychism. It's bringing through messages. There's low trance mediumship, where you don't necessarily feel much difference in your consciousness, and there's high trance mediumship, where your consciousness may be completely absent from what you're doing, and a whole range in between. The most common sort of mediumship that we see, which is usually not described that way, but I think should be, is clairvoyance, where you receive messages from Spirit either in verbal or visual ways. And we'll be talking in much greater detail about that in a future class, but it comes to you through your chakras, into your brain, from Spirit. If you're doing a reading for someone, it's coming out of their energy. And you receive it in that way. It comes through your crown and your third eye chakra, and you receive it as a knowing, as a verbal message, or as a visual message. Again, it's not normally thought of as mediumship, but really you are being the medium for that energetic message. And so I would say that we should think of it as a kind of mediumship. And there are all kinds of things that we can say about this, and I guess we're going to say a few things about it. But we'll talk in much greater detail about it later. But for most people taking these lessons, this is probably what you're going for. Some of you may be looking to become professional psychics, and for most professional psychics, this is the kind of thing they're going to be working with, or forms of divination. And you'll find when you work extensively with divination, although you're asking for omens to interpret, you're also going to be interpreting them clairvoyantly, even if you're not being conscious of it. That part of you will be involved. But with mediumship, with clairvoyance, there are a number of very important things to say. One of them, and this is also true for everything we've already talked about, but we want to pay attention to our psychic hygiene. We want to clear and release excess energy before and after we do anything with this kind of work. And if you're doing clairvoyance and you're doing a lot of it, you may want to do this during it also. If you are doing like a psychic fair or a psychic party or just working with friends, and you're reading for a lot of people, you should clear and release between each one. This is how you prevent blocking your energy in the first place. Because when we hold on to excess energy, it blocks our energy. It can cause all kinds of problems that can leave us very ungrounded. We've already talked about that. But it's important enough to reemphasize again. When you're doing clairvoyance, it's very important that you say what you get. This can be difficult if what you get is highly emotional. But in my experience, if you get it, the person you're working with needs to hear it. Now, you may want to sugarcoat it a little bit for them, and you want to avoid being that psychic who tells people terrible things. I think I've mentioned before, one of the most objectionable things I've ever seen was a famous psychic that I used to work with, who had a pregnant woman come to her for a reading and said, "Oh, you're going to miscarry. You should never do that because you could be wrong." We've talked about how I think we've talked about how messengers can warp the message. If we haven't, we will. People have different levels of connection when they do this kind of work. Sometimes you'll have a better connection with a client than other times. There are any number of readings, any number of reasons in a reading that your message could be wrong. So don't tell them something like that. Don't say, "Oh, you're going to die on Thursday." That's terrible. It's terrible because one, you may end up looking like a fool. And two, sometimes the client will go out and make it come true because of their belief in it, depending on what it is. So avoid catastrophic messages. However, that doesn't mean you don't say anything. What my famous friend who did the "you're going to miscarry" reading should, in my opinion, have said is, make sure you're taking good care of your health. Make sure you're doing everything you should do, especially at this time. There is a possibility that might require extra caution. So make sure that you're doing everything you need to do. And if you have any problems, make sure you get help immediately. But don't tell them the worst possible outcome because it's never absolute. Another thing we have to discuss when talking about psychic messages, and we just discussed it, is that they can always be changed by the person they're received by. That's half the reason of getting them. In some cases, if someone receives a catastrophic message, they may find ways to make it come true because they've accepted it, but they can also find ways to change it. And particularly for people who also are practicing manifestation, this is true. If you get a message that is not what you want to happen, you can work on changing it. But forewarned is forearmed. And so when you give that message that is unpleasant, that could be seen as catastrophic, you want to emphasize the positive outcome it could also have and get the person working toward that positive outcome. Say that you see someone's going to be in a car accident. You don't necessarily want to say you're going to be in a car accident at such and such a time. You should say, make sure that you're being very careful in your driving. You might even say, there's a possibility, but try to avoid it by being responsible. Try to avoid it by being careful at that time. Don't take unnecessary risks, that sort of thing. It's more responsible on your part and gives them a wider range of response on theirs. Because how we react to psychic messages is just as important as getting them. And particularly people who work with manifestation, who are working with psychic things, their will becomes powerful. And you don't want to convince them that something must go badly. It's much better to convince them that there's a danger that they can overcome. Because they always can. It's always part of this work. Right now, we're talking about psychism as a passive art of receiving messages and so forth. But you can send that energy back out in very, very important and positive ways that we'll talk about in future classes. Just as easily as you can receive it. And that's what we mean by manifesting. By focusing on your desires, by focusing on positive outcomes or avoiding negative outcomes, you can influence what you get. And this is another important aspect of psychism in our lives, not really something I should wander into in the middle of our discussion on mediumship, but it's an important part to remember. So if you get, either for yourself or someone else, a very negative message, remember you can change that outcome by applying your psychic abilities in active ways rather than simply in passive ways. Now, continuing with our discussion of mediumship, we've talked about clairvoyance. What most people think about under the term mediumship is bringing through messages from discarnate spirits, those who might be described as being dead, those who might be described as being non-corporeal in general. For example, some people will bring through messages from angels. Some people will bring through messages from aliens. There are a lot of different things that people work with. But this is usually what the term mediumship or channeling is used to describe. Only know one person who does dinosaurs, and that was a comedy act. But it was good. I attribute that to the idea that although I believe every incarnation continues to exist somewhere in the soul, I think there's a point at which they cease to be easily contacted. Millions of years would certainly fulfill that point. So I don't think anyone's actually going to be getting a lot from the dinosaurs. I've not seen any reason to think people are going to get a lot from prehistory. Although there was a very good psychic called Karl Auschwitz, who was very famous between the First and Second World War, who specialized in many cases on things from prehistoric Europe, but he wasn't getting them. He was getting them as psychometric readings rather than communications from people. He would handle objects and receive impressions from them. I think that can be done. But I think at that point, the person is so far forgotten that you're not going to be able to bring through messages easily. I won't say it's impossible. At the Lawrence Museum of Magic and Witchcraft, they had a very remarkable exhibit, which was given to them because it was so highly haunted. And the museum it was originally at was uncomfortable with keeping it, even though they would never admit that in public. But since Lawrence Museum was an actual museum, they were able to accept it. And it was, at that time, I believe, the earliest relics of a shaman found in the United States, or what was believed to be a shaman. I don't think that's still true, but it was at the time. And what they received was the lady's skull and the weapon that killed her. And I think the other things stayed with the museum. They had a bag of herbs that had belonged to her, other items that had been found in this grave. It was about 5,000 years old. And people at the museum, both museums, at the first museum, things happened to this exhibit. It would move around, glass would shatter, etc. At the Lawrence Museum, none of that happened because being a psychic, he realized that he needed to put the weapon that had killed this woman together with her skull. That separating them is what was disturbing him. But having done that, he no longer had any kind of poltergeist type of activities. But people did start to see her spirit in the museum. And they described her as a not very tall woman, obviously Native American. And although they did not get messages from her, they saw her. So, 5,000 years ago, yes, you can get messages from someone from that period. Much harder to get anything much earlier than that, in my experience. Usually, you're going to be working with more recent spirits, often people that you or the people you're working with have known directly, sometimes a little earlier in history. And you'll be getting your message from them. We'll go on to non-human spirits in a moment. When you do this kind of work, what you get is going to depend on what your skills are. When I do this kind of work, I get all kinds of visuals. And that's because I'm a very visual person. I'm a visual artist. I can usually describe the spirit that I'm seeing when I'm getting the message. I can often describe things out of their lives. One of the things I specialized in as a professional reader was doing past life readings in which I would get all kinds of information, partly because I could see it, and partly because I'm very well versed in history, so I could interpret it. And we'll come back to that in a moment too. But a person who is less visual might not experience it that way, but their way is no less legitimate. One of the things I found in all the writing that I've done over the years, I originally used the word visualization very heavily before I found out that many people don't visualize. It just doesn't happen for them. I cannot remember a time in my life that I could not visualize, but other people just don't have it. But what they do have is they can feel the energy. That's every bit as good, arguably a little farther along. And so what I say now is imagine that energy, and everybody can seem to work with that. So depending on where your skills are, how you receive this kind of channeled message will be different for you. When I first started learning this, we started with Ouija boards. I should say a few words about Ouija boards because everybody loves Ouija boards. And what I would say about them is that if you treat them as a psychic tool rather than a game, and you're pursuing them in the way that you would pursue any kind of psychic work with proper psychic hygiene, with shielding of your working area, a nice little prayer before you start, you should have no problem. They're a piece of cardboard with a sticker on them, not a gateway to hell. So don't worry about that. Having said that, they're a very primitive technique. And if you follow the instructions I've given and will give for how to speak with spirits, you'll never need them. But I had to throw that in because I just have to poke the bear. But from that, I first started getting messages as words that would spell themselves out in my mind, and then as verbal messages. And then after doing that for probably not a very long time, although it seemed long then, the spirits I was working with, who were mostly ancestors, said to me, ancestors and spirit guides said, you could see us if you want to. And I said, really? I'm not aware of that. And they said, oh, yes, all you have to do is do it. And in that case, they said, come sit at the dining room and imagine us sitting there with you, and you'll see. So I went to the dining room, sat at the table, imagined my spirit guide sitting at the table with me, and they just took off from there. So that was my personal development to being a very visual medium. And this was all low trance. My conscious self was never gone. And most of what we talked about so far is low trance. Now, even when you do low trance, you may lose what you bring through after you're done. So you should write it down or speak it out if you're working with someone, because it's moving through you, not coming from you. But you won't feel like you've gone somewhere else. You'll know that you're there. You will feel a difference, but it will take you a while to understand what you're feeling. And I used to regularly do channelings for 5 and 6 hours at a time in low trance. My consciousness was never gone. High trance is another matter. When people do high trance, they are not aware of what's happening. Their consciousness is elsewhere. My late wife was a high trance psychic. And she said that she would experience herself being off in the astral plane somewhere while she was bringing through messages. Occasionally, she would be in the room and watching what was happening, but she was not in her own body receiving the messages. That's high trance. Not everyone is comfortable with the idea of high trance, and there's no inherent need for it because the messages you receive with low trance are just as good. But that's the difference between these things. Now, how do you know that what you're receiving is not imagination? I think we may have talked about this already, but we'll talk about it now. The best way to tell that it's not imagination is that as you do this, very quickly, you will start getting messages you could not have known. You'll get information you could not have known, and they will choose things to tell you, to show you that it's not your imagination, things you could not have extrapolated, things that that could not have been your imagination. And if this does not come fast enough, ask them to do it. They will send you things. Again, when you're doing this kind of work, you usually are working with your spirit guides and or your ancestors, and then through them with a wider group of spirits. But people do experience it differently. And we'll talk about that in our class that's specifically on this art. Most people have, whether they're consciously working with them or not, a number of spirit guides. 5 is a conventional number. It may be many more than that. It could be fewer. But one of them is a gatekeeper guide whose job is to keep out the spirits you would not want to be talking to. And I've always had a very good gatekeeper guide. But what you choose to do will also influence what that gatekeeper guide can let in or keep out. One of my favorite stories, going back to Ouija boards, because you always got to go back to Ouija boards. Years ago, I was on a radio show from Telepathic Radio, one of my favorite shows. And this show is called Ouija Board, Psychic Tool or Gateway to Hell, 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 Hell. And there were 2 of us, myself and Howard Heim. I was taking the point of view that a Ouija board is simply a psychic tool. And he was taking the point of view that, no, it's a gateway to hell, 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 hell. And he told the story about a group of drunken frat boys who took their Ouija board to the graveyard, to a local graveyard with the intention of having a spooky experience. And they got one. Well, they set it up. They asked for it. And if you're like a paranormal researcher and you're wanting to talk to troubled spirits, of course your gatekeeper guide will let those spirits through. You've asked for it. It's what you've set for yourself. So make sure you know what you're setting. And I, in my many years of experience, have worked with troubled spirits, working to help cross them over. But I've never had a problem with it. What I've found is a little patience and perseverance. Even the most troubled spirit can be helped and healed and helped to cross over, which is ideally what you should do with them. Because when you encounter that kind of troubled spirit, at least if we're talking about a human spirit, they're caught between the worlds. They have died, but some sort of trauma or attachment has held them closer to this world than to the next world. And you want to help them, quote, go through the light, end quote. And sometimes you'll see that opening as light. Sometimes you may see it in other ways. A lot of people have seen it historically as a river that you cross over. All kinds of different things. But when you're doing that kind of work, that's your goal, ideally. Unless you're on certain television shows in which you want to kind of find a demon in the basement and frighten everyone. But that really should not be your goal. Now, we've talked about low trance work, we talked about high trance work, and we talked about working with human spirits. There are two circumstances in which you're likely to be working with them. One, where they are giving messages to their loved ones in this world or to you, either just as a spirit who they want to talk to, the loved ones want to talk to. This is what we often do at seances, or as spirit guides, which we also often do at seances. Spirit guides are there to guide and influence people. They always have plenty to say, which isn't necessarily true of random loved ones, although sometimes they have a lot to say too. But that is most of what you'll be dealing with this kind of channeling under normal circumstances. Some people, however, deal with what we might consider extra or non-human entities, such as the idea of ascended masters or bodhisattvas, who once were human but have moved beyond it. Some people feel they're channeling angels who have, I believe, depending on your definition of angel, they may feel that these are entities that have never been physically incarnate. Some work with elemental spirits. There are all kinds of different things you can work with. That's going to be a different experience. But usually if you're working with those types of entities, what they're going to be giving you is spiritual teachings to help you with your spiritual growth. Perfectly legitimate. But I do want to say that the messenger can warp the message. I also have to throw a story in here. I think I may have already told this in previous classes, but I'm going to throw it in again. Lady Crystal, when she was teaching me, was very heavily influenced by the works of Seth and Jane Roberts. Years later, we saw a videotape of Jane Roberts channeling Seth. In this videotape, this perfectly ordinary woman brought through this entity who sounded like Bela Lugosi on a bad day. If we had heard this tape before we read the books, we would have paid no attention. We would have thought it was ridiculous. This is part of my speech on why, when you do this kind of thing, you want to avoid Hopi accents. Those are coming from you, not from the spirit. We'll talk about that in greater detail in our class on this kind of work, but it's very important to know. When we're working with what we think of as being non-human spirits, we also want to be careful of our assumptions. It is entirely possible to force our assumptions onto the spirits we're working with. One of my favorite stories about this is that years ago, the Haikarel family, which I come from, was all about channeling the ancestors. And they were always very dignified and august in those channelings until one of our members, Lady Bitterwind, who came to us first as a member of our public temple, later became a member of the family, but she said to us, you know, what I don't like about your channeling sessions when you bring through the ancestors is that they're so dignified. And yet from all the stories you've told me about your ancestors, they were a bunch of rounders. They loved to have their fun. They were humorous and lively and so different from the very dignified way you channel them. I think you're censoring them. And we were taken aback. It has never occurred to us that we could censor them. And so the next time we spoke to the ancestors, we said, ancestors, are we censoring you? And they said, duh, literally. And from that moment forward, they were always very humorous and far more lively than they had been previously because we gave them permission to be, and we had not been giving them permission before. This is one of the reasons why in certain forms of divination, in all forms of psychic work, many people will say that you should never read for yourself. The reason you shouldn't do that is you do not have distance from your own issues. Your hopes and fears can censor the information you get. Now, I will tell you that you can rise above that and read for yourself perfectly well, but you always must remember that your hopes and fears can influence that message. So also, if you're going to be trying to work with non-human entities, you may want to remember that you may also be projecting things onto them based on your previous assumptions of what you're working with. My advice in all those things I just said is be as passive and impartial as you can in what you bring through. And then you'll get good information. I have a story for this. I'm an old man. I got stories for everything. Get off my grass. Actually, I would never do that because I don't particularly like grass, but that's beside the point. One of the great channelers of history was Dr. John Dee, who worked with a man named Edward Kelly. And the way they worked was actually Kelly who brought through the messages and Dee who interpreted them, which is a very old form of psychic reading. They believed for a long time that they were working with Christian angels. And the messages they got were actually far more universal than that. But they didn't get anything that challenged their Christian assumptions as they were doing this, because they were putting that censorship on it. The angels they were working with had to stay within the doctrine of the church they belonged to. But as they went forward, they got better at channeling. And there came a point when the angels gave a message that did not conform to the Church of England. And quite shocked Dr. Dee, maybe not Edward Kelly. And that message was that Jesus Christ was a great philosopher, not a god, in the sense they were thinking, and that the universe existed separate from the mythology they were following. As I recall, they could not exactly handle this message and pretty much ignored it. But they had become passive enough to stop censoring, and they got it. So if you're working with, for example, angels or aliens or what have you, make sure you're being passive enough to receive what they're actually saying to you. Now, I have worked with aliens, quote unquote. I understand them as dimensional travelers. And I'm talking about the gray aliens with the big eyes. And every time I've ever encountered them for myself or any other person, they were psychic healing entities. That's what they did. And I found, once I realized this, when I looked at ufology, all those stories of UFO encounters and abductions, that usually the victim of the abduction would subsequently experience a great opening, often of talents they had not had previously, sometimes of the psychic arts, as if they'd gone through a healing. So it actually went along beautifully with the experiences I had, but they, of course, did not understand it that way because they were seeing it more in a science fiction paradigm. I see it in a spiritual paradigm. But this is something I've seen UFOs in my life. My grandmother saw them frequently. My father went to her house hoping to see them. When they normally appeared, they wouldn't come for him. I'm not surprised by that. But in my experience, it's a spiritual experience like other things that we're talking about. And so if you find yourself working with them, you may experience some of the things that people describe in UFO abductions, but working with them from a psychic point of view, you should understand it differently. One of the things you may experience, if they're doing energetic healing on you or on someone you're working with, is they may be unable to move. The reason they're unable to move, as I understand it, is that this is a very delicate process that it would be harmful to move during, so that they remain immobile. But this is one of the things often described in alien abductions. This is how I understand it. So I want to conclude that by saying that if you're doing channeling of what you believe to be non-human entities, make sure that you remain passive enough to get correct information about those that you're speaking with, because it may not be your first assumption. And you should trust them as you'd trust anyone else if you've developed it the way we're talking about, in a systematic, sensible way. you will have good experiences. But remember, the messenger can warp the message through their hopes and fears. And with that, we're going to conclude the class and have our exercise for the evening. And our exercise for this evening is going to work with mediumship. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to first clear and release all excess energy. Let it pour out of you like water, pouring down through your arms and your legs and out through your hands and your feet. And center yourself in the here and now. And take a moment to become aware of your heart chakra. Feel your heart chakra at the center of your chest, shining with a beautiful, bright, white light. That light is the light of spirit. It's the energy we spoke of earlier in the class that goes through everything, that comes from spirit and is the construction material of all things that exist. It's part of you. It's part of everything else. Let that light expand within you. Let it fill your entire body. Feel it expanding within you little bit by little bit until your entire body is filled. And then let it expand farther to fill your aura. And now, I want you to take a moment and ask your spirit guides, whether you work with them consciously or not, whether you know their names or any other information about them. Ask them to give you a message now. And then let that message come through to you. Don't hold on to anything that comes into your mind, but let it pass through like a cloud going across the sky, but pay attention to what it is because it will be your message. It may be a physical image, it may be a verbal message, it may just be a knowing, but let it come to you. Let it come to you, pay attention to what it is. We're not looking for a long message at this moment. We're just looking for the experience. When you've received your message, give thanks to your spirit guides. Take note of your message. Write it down if you have something to write with. Just remember it if you don't. And then allow all of that energy to fade. And once again, we're going to clear and release all excess energy, letting it pour out of us like water, returning to the universe, running through our arms and our legs and out through our hands and our feet. Allowing ourselves to return to normal. Again, take a moment to think of your message while it's still clear in your head. And that is a simple example of mediumship. And you may want to do this exercise after the class as well and see if you don't get more complex messages. That's really all that's involved. When I was learning mediumship, I was told again and again, this is the simplest thing on earth. You just have to let it happen. But until I let it happen, I could never understand that. I made it far more complicated than it was. You probably will too, but that's okay. We learn as we go. But by the end of this class, if you're not already doing it, you should be able to do it. So with that, we're going to end our evening's comments on different types of psychism. I want to thank you for joining class number 4 of Psychic 101. And this is Reverend Don Lewis, and thank you.